The Fisher King in Gotham, New Age Spiritualism Meets the Grail Legend by Robert J. Blanch. Set against the backdrop of New York City as a contemporary wasteland, a desolate terrain inhabited by eccentric vagrants, sadistic street thugs, mass murderers, and radio shock jocks, The Fisher King, 1991, TriStar Pictures, weaves a cinematic tale of love, understanding, and redemption. Reflecting an updating of the Grail legend, The Fisher King focuses on two central mythic figures, Percival, Parry, the great fool, the forthright, simple, uncorrupted, noble son of nature, without guile, strong in the purity of the yearning of his heart, Campbell, Occidental Mythology, 508, and the maimed Fisher King, Jack Lucas. In the course of this cinematic narrative, a bizarre symbiotic bond develops between Parry, a schizophrenic derelict and former medievalist whose journey into a dark, hallucinatory world has been triggered by the death of his wife, and Lucas, a spiritually barren talk show host. On one occasion, however, the broadcaster goads a deranged caller, Edwin Malnick, into socioeconomic cleansing. After Lucas urges Edwin, they, yuppies, must be stopped before it's too late. It's us or them. The alienated fan then kills 7 people, including Parry's wife, at Babbitt's, one of those chic, yuppie watering holes. Some 3 years later, when we next see Lucas, Jeff Bridges, the arrogant disc jockey is paralyzed with guilt and self-loathing. Unable to function because of his psychic wound, his unwitting participation in Edwin's mass murder, the unemployed Lucas now wastes away in an alcoholic stupor and trifles with the affections of Anne Mercedes Ruel, a sympathetic owner of a video store, The Video Spot. Clutching a Pinocchio doll one night as he contemplates suicide, you ever get the feeling sometimes that you're being punished for your sins? Lucas stumbles drunkenly into New York's waterfront area. Accosted by 2 punks who want to douse him in gasoline, Lucas is rescued suddenly by the chivalrous Parry, Robin Williams, and a band of merry bums errant. Thus energized by their unexpected meeting, Parry, Percival, and Lucas, Fisher King, will embark upon their interlocked Grail quest, a quest for love, forgiveness, and spiritual renewal. While Parry must trek through nightmarish visions of the bloody death of his wife to an acceptance of her loss, Jack must travel from egotism and self-pity, I'm self-centered, I'm weak, into uncharted territory, the world of compassion and true camaraderie. In effect, then, The Fisher King highlights the interdependence of Parry and Jack, for spiritual revitalization and release from the stifling Gotham wasteland demand the total interaction of the two Grail figures. While the mythic roles of the film's 2 central characters seem clearly defined, both the Fisher King's screenwriter, Richard La Gravenese, and director, Terry Gilliam, consciously blur the lines between fool and wounded king. In The Search for the Holy Reel, for instance, La Gravenese maintains that Parry and Jack embody 2 essential selves, fool and wounded king. Similarly, in an interview, June 1990, with David Morgan, Gilliam claims that both of them, Parry and Lucas, is a Fisher King, and both of them is a fool. That the blurring of mythic roles is deliberate is noted further by Gilliam. I love the fact that there is this ambivalence. All myths, if they're dealt with properly, are never as clean-cut as we tend to see them. One side, if you twist it enough, becomes the other. Finally, in his Laserdisc commentary, Gilliam contends that the fool and the king are interchangeable figures. They both have been scarred in different ways, and both need an innocent to come and show them the way. Criterion. Of the 2 film characters, however, Lucas is more closely aligned with the Fisher King, who has lost the ability to love, while Parry still clearly can love. The Fisher King, because he can't love, his kingdom and the world around him become meaningless and barren. Such a cinematic, shape-shifting process may be fueled in part by New Age spiritualism, a fusion of the humanistic mythology of Joseph Campbell and the neo-Jungian theories of Robert A. Johnson, a popular psychologist. With these concepts in mind, then, I will explore both the general Campbellian ethos of the Fisher King and the impact of Jungian archetypes, as expounded by Johnson, upon the characters and themes of the film. Following this discussion, a key section of the article, I will investigate a possible Reagan agenda for the Fisher King, as well as important medieval elements in the film, including the Red Knight fantasy sequence. Viewing the Grail quest as a new mythology of man, Occidental Mythology 507, Campbell points to the search as a purely human endeavor, an individual adventure in experience. Furthermore, Campbell characterizes this secular pursuit of blessedness as an internal quest for those creative values by which the wasteland is redeemed. While The Fisher King is imbued generally with the ideas and humanistic spirit of Campbell, the film nevertheless underscores the significance of a joint quest for contemporary Grail values. As Parry notes to Jack early in the film, "I'm a knight on a special quest, and I need help. That's why they, little people, sent you, Jack." Although Parry and Jack cannot cure the malaise of New York City as Wasteland, they must embark on a shared journey to love, trust, forgiveness, and redemption. Crucial to the film's depiction of an interlaced Grail quest are the neo-Jungian concepts of Johnson. For Johnson's popular study, he, understanding masculine psychology, shaped La Gravenese's screenplay for The Fisher King. According to La Gravenese's reading of He, the Fisher King or Grail myth, when paralleled with the male psyche, becomes the story of every man's psychological and spiritual growth. Once a boy, Percival or the Fool starts his journey from innocence to maturity, he briefly touches God, or the God within, that part of ourselves that is our direct link to the divine, our souls. Since the boy is young and immature, he fails to comprehend his epiphany, thus leaving him with the imprint of a Fisher King wound. Such a wound represents in the boy's rite of passage the first touch of consciousness, the beginning stage of spiritual, emotional illumination, and the source of intense pain and psychic disunity. Furthermore, the Fisher King injury, localized in the male, generative, creative part of a man's being, deadens human feeling and thus creates detachment from other individuals. Symbolized by a fish, suggestive of Christ, of divine force, or of valuable and creative inner work, the Fisher King wound is triggered occasionally by a particular event, an injustice. Because the wound constitutes a spiritual maiming, the afflicted youth or fool must renounce an I-centered life and embrace service for the greater good or even someone to love. Perhaps the most potent expression of the boy's divine awakening and subsequent wound may be found in 2 episodes of the La Gravenese script for The Fisher King. After Jack realizes that Parry's wife was murdered by Malnick at the upscale nightclub, the now chastened Jack visits Parry's basement hideaway, a repository for all things medieval. Included among the homemade weapons, pictures of round table knights, and renditions of the Holy Grail is Parry's manuscript, The Fisher King, A Mythic Journey for Modern Man, a key to the former scholar's worldview. Somewhat later in the film, however, the 2 contemporary Grail figures converse in Central Park at night, for Parry seems compelled to make Jack comprehend the meaning of the Grail legend. This Central Park scene, involving a nude Parry cavorting in the Arcadian greenery, may suggest at once a temporary respite from his wasteland demons and a symbolic expression of Chrétien's Percival. At the beginning of Le Conte du Grail, the inexperienced Percival, a child of the woods, is depicted as a natural man, for he knows nothing about socially learned behavior or the chivalric ideals of knighthood. Invested with psychic energy, the contemporary Percival then narrates to Jack the tale of the Fisher King as a youth, who receives a mystical vision in fire of the Holy Grail, the symbol of God's divine grace. Once the boy feels like God, he attempts to take the Grail from its fiery covering, and the Grail vanished, leaving the youth with a wound. After the boy assumes the role of mature Fisher King, the wound festers, thereby plummeting the monarch into unrelievable despair. Because the Fisher King had no faith in any men, not even in himself, he is incapable of feeling any emotion, especially love, and thus veers inexorably towards death. One day, however, a fool offers the king a cup of water from the monarch's bedstand. Suddenly, as the Fisher King drinks the liquid, his wound heals magically, and the cup metamorphoses into the Grail. When the king demands a rational explanation for these marvelous events, the fool replies simply, "I don't know. I only knew you were thirsty." That Parry's highly individualized recasting of the Grail legend, buttressed by Johnson's New Age spiritualism, plays a prominent role in The Fisher King can be demonstrated easily. From the outset of the film, Parry, the insane former medievalist, can be termed a Percival figure, fool, for he views New York through the eyes of a medieval knight, and attempts to make a medieval world out of what, in fact, is a very modern world. Trusting that he embarks on a divine mission to get back something very special, Grail, which he, God, has lost, Parry's entrance into a hallucinatory Grail world, a dreamlike terrain peopled with red knights and Fisher Kings, is the product of both his academic background and his schizoid imagination. Furthermore, Parry's intense suffering, fueled by his wife's death, becomes the hallmark of his Fisher King wound, for A man suffering in this way is often driven to do idiotic things to cure the wound and ease the desperation he feels. Johnson, he, page 8. Once Parry interacts with the guilt-stricken Jack, the two join forces to heal their respective Fisher King wounds. Parry, first of all, must accept both his wife's death and the glimmerings of friendship raised by Jack. At the same time, Parry must force Jack to enter and to comprehend a visionary Grail world so that both men may experience spiritual and emotional redemption. Jack's psychic injury perhaps demands a total reshaping of character, for the disc jockey is essentially callous, cynical, and narcissistic. Thank God, I'm me. Reflecting the youthful Percival in Chrétien's Le Comte du Grail, Jack, a glib conversationalist, fails to listen to people and frequently interrupts a talk show caller's speech. As he sits inside the glass-enclosed sound booth at the studio, a symbolic rendition of his physical and emotional isolation, Jack seems to be king, but he's trapped. Dimly aware of his barren existence, one that feasts on public humiliation, he is driven to seek additional fame by starring in a television sitcom on the radio. While he discusses with his girlfriend, Sandra, Lara Harris, his vision of television success, Jack ponders his future biography. I used to think my biography ought to be Jack Lucas, the face behind the voice, but now it can be Jack Lucas, the face and the voice. Then, still caught up in his reverie of power and riches, he repeats the words from his television script, especially, "Forgive me," Jack's signature line and pop mantra. Once Edwin's mass murder is reported on television and Jack's sitcom contract is canceled, "Forgive me" underscores both Jack's despair and his need for psychic absolution. After Parry rescues him from suicide and potential maiming, a penitent Jack makes the first tentative steps from isolation and selfishness to membership in the human community. At first, however, Jack is rankled by his Fisher King wound, an unremitting source of pain and guilt. As Jack explains to Anne, "I really feel cursed. I feel like a magnet, for I attract shit. I wish there was some way I could just pay the fine and go home." Jack's inner torment abates somewhat when he contemplates assisting Parry. "I feel indebted to the guy, Parry. If I can help him in some way, then maybe things would change for me." Specifically, Jack attempts to comfort Parry by facilitating a relationship between Parry and Lydia, Amanda Plummer, the former medievalist's dream woman. Near the end of The Fisher King, however, Parry is knifed by two juvenile thugs and then falls into a catatonic state. Following Jack and Anne's initial visit with Parry at the mental hospital, Jack soon rejects an offer of a second weekly television series, a comedy celebrating the disc jockey's experiences with the homeless. Once again, Jack is drawn to Parry's basement apartment, where he gazes at a book on the Holy Grail. His memory thus jolted by the Grail images, Jack then recalls Parry's magazine photo of a Grail, actually a trophy belonging to a billionaire living on Fifth Avenue. In an ensuing scene at Parry's hospital bed, however, redemption is at hand for Jack. At first, Jack protests violently to the speechless Parry. "I'm not responsible, and I don't feel guilty. It's easy being nuts. Try being me." Then, moved by genuine love and pity for Parry, Jack relents. "If I do this, obtain the Grail, it's because I want to do this for you. For you." In order to complete this Grail quest, Jack assumes the role of the fool and must step into Parry's world in order to save the psychically wounded Fisher King. As he scales a wall surrounding the billionaire's townhouse, the 94th Street Armory, eerily reminiscent of a medieval fortress, Jack enters Parry's medieval fantasyland. Viewing a huge red knight depicted on a stained glass window and hearing a horse whinny, Jack notes, "I hear horses. Parry will be so pleased." After imagining that he is being shot, Jack extracts the trophy, Grail, from its display case, flees from the building, and eventually places the cup in Parry's hands. Once Parry wakes up from his catatonic state, he expresses his love for Lydia, and Jack's selfless concern for Parry, demonstrated by his heroic act at the Castle Paralysis, spills over into true devotion to Anne, Jack's long-suffering beloved. With the blighted New York landscape once prosperous again, symbolized by the blaze of fireworks and the glare of skyscrapers, the now redeemed Parry and Jack return to their natural states and frolic nude in Central Park. While the La Gravenese screenplay for The Fisher King clearly reflects the imprint of New Age spiritualism, especially Johnson's neo-Jungian concepts and themes, equally important are the film's socioeconomic and socio-political underpinnings. Through its careful portrait of contemporary problems and its finely etched dialogue, the movie mounts a radical assault on the politics of illusions that underlie the Reagan Revolution. Beneath the glossy surface of trickle-down economics supposedly benefiting the poor, tax equity, and deregulation lies a deep chasm between the rich and powerful and a powerless underclass. While The Fisher King does address recurrent social problems, homophobia, the attempted torching of Jack and the beating of the gay cabaret singer in Central Park, and AIDS, Michael Jeter's plaintive comment, "I watched all my friends die," I will scrutinize the interplay between the affluent and the downtrodden. Early in the film, as Jack ponders a new script, on the radio, a street person bangs on his limousine window and begs for money. Although Jack has all the trappings of success, power, and money, he is completely indifferent to the bum's plight. A couple of quarters isn't going to make any difference anyway. After Jack hears of Edwin's massacre, however, he gets drunk and wanders in the rain, his clothes soaked and torn, near the Plaza Hotel. In front of the hotel walks an affluent man, who is accosted suddenly by a desperate vagrant. Although the hotel guest tips the plaza doorman, the rich man refuses to recognize the bum or to give him money, thereby infuriating the vagrant. Once Jack assumes the role of a tramp, he begins to comprehend the suffering of the homeless. Energized partly by concern for Parry's welfare and partly by a lingering sense of guilt, Jack offers Parry $70. "I just would like to help you. I thought you could use some money." Although Parry gives the money to a street person, the former medievalist is touched by Jack's protective gesture. "You're a real human being. You're a true friend." Additional evidence, which serves to highlight the obscene schism between wealth and poverty during the 1980s, may be found in the bizarre episode of the stockbroker bum. Formerly an affluent stockbroker, this man is now reduced to begging on the street and to engaging in imaginary conversations on a disconnected phone. When this deranged man first appears on the screen, he bellows into the telephone, "Sell! Sell! Sell!" After he receives Jack's money from Parry, however, the former stockbroker yells into the receiver, "Buy! Buy! Buy! Fuck 'em all!" As Osberg explains, it is hard to know if his job has driven him mad or if his job was itself a kind of madness. Perhaps the most potent social commentary may be found in an episode involving a crippled Vietnam veteran, Tom Waits, who begs, cup in hand, at Grand Central Station. While Jack and Parry await Lydia's arrival, most of the frenzied commuters rush by, ignoring the legless veteran. One man, however, tosses a coin that misses the cup, thus prompting Jack to react angrily, "Asshole, didn't even look at you, veteran." Comprehending fully that commuters supply money both to avoid eye contact, humanizing the poor, and to salve their guilty consciences, the veteran answers, "He's paying so he doesn't have to look." Such a remark leads the veteran to launch into an incisive analysis of thoroughly disgruntled workers who wish to stab their rich employers. If the workers' alienation flares into violence, they will be forced to beg for a living. Say, guy goes to work every day, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, and gets his nuts so tied in a vice he starts questioning the very fabric of his existence. Then one day, about quitting time, his boss calls him into the office. "Come into my office and kiss my ass for me." And Bob, the worker, says, "I just want to see the expression on his face as I jam this pair of scissors into his arm." Then he, worker, thinks of me, crippled vet. He says, "It's not so bad. At least I got 2 arms and 2 legs and I ain't begging for money. I'm, vet, what you call a kind of moral traffic light. Like I'm saying, red, go no further." Conjoined with this social commentary, the moral subtext of The Fisher King is a rich panoply of medieval elements, part of the vital spiritual landscape of the film. Such elements will include the import of medieval sign theory, especially image word theory, the leitmotif of wind-blown paper, the Holy Grail symbol, the medievalization of key characters, garb, or setting, the use of high diction, and the Red Knight fantasy sequence. Central to Monica Potke's interpretation of the film, an allegory of image word theory, is the marriage of the rational word, verbal medium, and the emotional image, visual medium, in medieval semiotics. Noting that Jack, a talk show host, is heard but never seen, Potke contends that he cannot perceive the real power of either words or images, especially the meaning of a Grail vision. Jack, however, achieves spiritual peace and wholeness when he finally comprehends the interrelation of word and image, his accepting the love of a woman who owns a video rental store. The visual assumes dramatic form, likewise in the recurrent motif of windblown paper, in The Fisher King. Suggesting the disintegration at the core of the film, windblown paper is often linked visually with archways or doorways marking liminal and transitional narrative junctures. In the first example, a down-and-out Jack, contemplates suicide as he sits near the statue of a heroic figure, William Tecumseh Sherman. Suddenly, the wind blows first one, then a second, then a third sheet of paper across the frame. After Jack's attempted suicide, however, Parry and Jack converse in front of Carmichael's mansion. Expressing his need to obtain the magnet's Grail, Parry notes to Jack, "I have a quest." Just then, a sheet of paper sails across the screen between Parry and the camera, linking the idea of quest with fragments of the book with the history of narrative romance. A final paper transition in the film narrative occurs when Jack searches desperately for Parry among the destitute street wanderers. Such a transition, emblematic of Lucas's new spiritual quest for atonement and love, is highlighted by a massive granite block wall with a backlighted Roman arch toward which Jack walks. Once again, sheets of paper fly by. These fluttering, wind-driven sheets of paper resemble nothing so much as pages torn from books, the torn and detached pages of apparently once coherent narratives. Occupying a key position both in medieval literature and in The Fisher King, the Holy Grail, a multivalent image, naturally invites conflicting interpretations. Although the Grail is portrayed as a holy thing, in Kibler's translation of Le Conte du Graal, this object, a kind of covered serving dish found in wealthy households, is not linked by Chrétien with the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. Grail romancers after Chrétien, however, invest the Grail with mystical significance. For example, in The Quest of the Holy Grail, a 13th century spiritual fable and part of the prose Lancelot, the Grail vessel represents an emblem of God's grace. For 20th century writers and filmmakers, however, the Grail symbol reflects humanistic concerns, understanding or knowledge, wisdom. Accordingly, in The Fisher King, Terry Gilliam identifies the Grail with love, rediscovering humanity, and the ability to love. And the character Anne links this holy object with Jesus' juice glass. Only the crazed Parry in the movie attempts to place the Grail within an ordering medieval context, the symbol of God's divine grace. Inasmuch as Parry views himself as a medieval knight out rescuing the poor and the downtrodden, he is energized by heroic exploits. In the underworld scene near the Manhattan Bridge, for example, Parry saves Lucas from two murderous teenagers. Yet Parry's role of chivalric knight is undercut by his bizarre garb, a cosmic cross between a street person and a medieval knight. Carrying over his shoulders a Goodwill Industries version of medieval bow and arrows, he is dressed in tattered clothing, including underclothes that vaguely suggest chainmail. His ragged garments partly hidden by a long overcoat, Parry also wears a woman's hat with silly sequins on it. Even his weapons, knotted tube socks with softballs at the bottom, are reminiscent of homemade devices used in a street brawl, not of knightly implements of war. This undercutting of the medieval continues when Jack subsequently searches for Parry in the basement apartment, the world of Parry's fractured imagination. Along with the medieval collage, pasted sketches of knights, castles, holy grails, and symbols of the Crusades is a grotesque drawing of a red knight with his head scratched out, suggesting perhaps the violence underneath the surface of Parry. Erected in a corner of the basement, away from the furnace, is Parry's chapel built to his dream girl, Lydia. Yet even this chapel of love is subverted by its odd mixture of the medieval and the contemporary. Containing a spooky, strange collection of disparate elements, Parry's Minagrota includes a portrait of a frail, long-haired medieval maiden, candles, soy sauce, jawbreakers candy, and a cheap romance novel, A Woman of Substance. Apart from Parry's medievalization and subsequent undercutting, two other characters in The Fisher King receive similar treatment. The Lydia character, for instance, is based on Chrétien's Blanch, a thin and pale maiden whose tresses flowed free, and the beholder would mistake them for fine gold, they were so lustrous. Since Blanche, deeply in love with Percival, hopes to inspire him to do battle in defense of her land and herself, she represents the knight's carrier of inspiration, the very core of heroic action. Johnson, he. To make this connection between Chrétien's Blanche and the film character of Lydia, however, Gilliam needed a Lydia who appeared to be from another time, as if what Parry saw in her stemmed from his own background in medieval history. Gilliam apparently succeeds in his venture, for Parry develops fully his fantasy image of Lydia, a beautiful medieval maiden. While Parry's perception of Lydia is clouded by love, the real Lydia of the movie is an ungainly, self-conscious woman who drops food in her lap and has difficulty making friends or attracting lovers. As Lydia explains to Anne, it's not easy in this day and age. Meeting people, I never really went through a dating period. A final example of deflating medieval characterization may be found in the Central Park episode shortly after Parry and Jack chase after the Red Knight. Hearing the wails of a wounded man, Parry and Jack rush immediately to his aid. After Jack muses over the gay cabaret singer's, Michael Jeter's, wounds and masochistic behavior, Jack inquires of the man, "Do you want to stay here?" The beaten man then responds sarcastically, "Oh yes, sure. I just love bleeding and horse shit. How very Gandhi-esque of you." This episode is significant because it skewers a conventional motif in medieval romance, the rescue of an imperiled lady, usually in a castle tower. Furthermore, as Gilliam contends, Jeter's voice is so high, Jeter could almost be a woman, a maiden in distress, a half-maiden in distress. The spirit of medievalism likewise colors the exalted diction used in The Fisher King, notably in Parry's speeches. Osberg, for instance, offers the following explanation for Parry's dignified language. Parry's idiolect contains a high language of chivalry and idealism, romance. Although Osberg's analysis may well be on the mark, one cannot dismiss the imprint of trashy romance novels on Parry's language. Inasmuch as Parry venerates Lydia as Blanche Fleur, along with the objects that Lydia cherishes, soy sauce, jawbreakers, trashy romances, it is no surprise that Parry offers a spirited justification for cheap romance novels. In the original La Gravenese screenplay, for example, Parry articulates his romance credo. Romance is romance no matter what kind it is. As long as there's heart, passion, and a little bit of fantasy, romance is the stuff of dreams. There's always more to trash than meets the eye. That contemporary romance novels, not the original medieval romances, are marked by stilted rhetorical flourishes is revealed clearly in two of Parry's speeches. Standing outside the Metropolitan Life Building, Parry offers the unseen Lydia an overblown soliloquy, a 20th century romance novel equivalent of a courtly lover's suffering. "Sovereign princes of this captive heart, what dire affliction hast thou made me suffer, thus banished from thy presence with reproach, and fettered by thy rigorous command, not to appear again before thy beautiful face. Deign, princess, to remember this thy faithful servant who now endures such misery for love of thee." Such pretentious pseudo-medieval diction resonates in another scene, the episode involving Parry's rescue of the bleeding cabaret singer in Central Park. "Heaven be praised in giving me so soon an opportunity to fulfill the duties of my profession. These cries doubtless proceed from some male or female in need of my immediate aid and protection." Both of these passages from The Fisher King illustrate cogently the fragmentation of Parry's imagination as he voices genuine medieval concerns, courtly love pain, and defense of an endangered human with an inappropriate means, contemporary romance novel diction. Furthermore, Parry's language echoes, albeit unintentionally, the overly formal diction used by Hollywood filmmakers of the 1940s and 1950s in their cinematic renditions of the Arthurian legend. Finally, in his quest to recapture the flavor of the Middle Ages, Gilliam employs his visual imagination to depict New York as a spiritual landscape that Parry allows them, viewers, to see. Especially vital to Gilliam's medievalization of the Manhattan setting are Parry's recurring fantasies of a red knight, Chris Howell, part armored man and part tree, riding a red horse that spews fire. Appearing at significant junctures in the film, the Red Knight visions, indebted to Chrétien, Johnson, and Gilliam, highlight Parry's intense terror, despair, and pain, and establish the reality of Parry's madness. With his initial foray into the chivalric world of martial prowess, Percival kills the menacing Red Knight by hurling a javelin through the knight's eyes and brain, Leconte du Grail. After assuming only the dead knight's arms, the foolish Percival is then termed the Red Knight. Since the Red Knight suggests the shadow side of masculinity, the negative, potentially destructive power, Johnson, he, Percival's bloody slaying of the Red Knight marks both the boy's violent initiation into manhood and the restoration of Camelot's honor. In The Fisher King, however, Gilliam inverts the roles of winner and loser in the Red Knight battle of Leconte du Grail, thus transforming Parry into a beaten and defeated shy man. Furthermore, Gilliam selects two details from the Chrétien narrative, bloodshed and violent penetration of the Red Knight's eyes and brain, and shapes them into arresting cinematic forces. The redness of the film's knight, for example, constitutes both a visceral reminder of Percival's bloody defeat of the Red Knight and a suggestion of Parry's suffering over the murder of his wife. But now that the defeated Red Knight in Chrétien's tale is an aggressive winner in the movie, he will transform Parry virtually into a dead man. The spiritually and emotionally dead Parry will thus have to endure both the penetration of his brain, the psychic injury of insanity, and the piercing of his eyes, horrific visual hallucinations of the Red Knight. Since such visions represent a terrible nightmare that must be confronted, Parry must learn to accept the loss of his wife through murder and to embrace a new love. Apart from Jack's Red Knight delusion at the billionaire's castellated townhouse, 3 nightmarish visions of the Red Knight appear in The Fisher King. In the first episode, Parry and Jack stand gazing at Carmichael's turreted mansion. Once Jack punctures any notion of a real Grail, he reminds Parry of the former medievalist's life at Hunter College. "I know who you are. You're a teacher." The Red Knight phantasm then suddenly looms up before Parry, thus causing the crazed street person to scream and to cower. Because Jack is present when this apparition reveals itself, Parry's fear subsides. After Parry sees the knight inching away, Parry notes to Jack, "He's, Red Knight, afraid of you." The 2 Grail figures then chase the Red Knight into Central Park, even though Jack fails to perceive the object of the joint pursuit. Unlike this extended Red Knight incident, the knight's second appearance in the film is very brief. After Parry recounts the Fisher King legend to Jack in a nightmare Central Park setting, the former medievalist informs Jack, "I think I heard that legend in a lecture once. Some professor at Hunt." Experiencing momentary panic over the recollection of his former life, Parry looks up suddenly and sees the staring Red Knight astride a fire-breathing red steed. The final and most devastating vision of the Red Knight takes place outside Lydia's apartment building. After Parry tells her, "I'm in love with you, not just from tonight. I've known you for a long time," the 2 lovers kiss and Lydia runs into her building. Then, spying the knight at the end of the street, Parry whimpers plaintively, "Please, let me have this," his new love. A blinding series of shocking flashbacks are then intercut with the scene of the Red Knight galloping after Parry. Such images include Malnick with a gun as Parry and his smiling wife kiss, blood oozing out of his wife's body as she falls to the floor, and Parry riding off to the mental hospital. When the exhausted Parry arrives at a promenade along the riverfront, he is accosted by 2 knife-wielding thugs separated from each other by the Red Knight. As the knight points a sword at Parry, one of the thugs slashes Parry. Thus, psychically crippled and physically maimed by this series of events, Parry desperately needs the salvific Grail cup to make him whole once again. Since Parry had already pointed out to Jack the urgency for an interdependent Grail quest, Jack must now embrace true love and selflessness in order to complete Parry's Grail mission. Once Jack identifies with the fool part of his persona, journeys into Parry's vision world of Red Knights and Grails, and steals the trophy, both Grail figures, Parry and Jack, will achieve redemption. At that point, the Fisher King wound emanating from the dolorous stroke will fade away, and prosperity will be restored to the ravaged New York wasteland.